Today we're gonna see a beautiful game where Magnus Carlsen made his best to violate every single opening rule that you ever heard of and still win. Carlsen was playing white in the title Tuesday and he opens up with the worst first move in chess, pawn to g4, known as the Grob attack. His opponent, a Polish grandmaster Nasuta, responds with the main line, pawn d5, grab in the center, as well as opening up this attack to the pawn on g4. And what do you think white does? Well, Carlsen found probably the worst possible way to defend this pawn. In order to do that, he gave up the central pawn. Now, there is a little bit of a justification that at least this pawn on g4 is now defended. However, of course, he gives up an even more important central pawn, which his opponent certainly grabs. Now Carlsen finally plays a sensible move, knight to c3, bringing the knight into play, and as well as hitting this pawn, black continues with pawn to e5. Now, which move would you expect here white to play? Well, maybe white could recapture his sacrificed pawn. Or probably he needs to develop his central pieces, fight for the center, castle, and so on and so forth. So what does Carlsen do? He plays pawn h4. And it's really funny. As a chess coach, these are the moves that I often see from beginners and tell them not to play, but here it's just funny that Carlsen is using these moves to troll his opponent, who's not just a random guy, he is a grandmaster actually, which just goes to show that, well, there's level to things. Black keeps playing normal chess, he develops a knight, white goes bishop g2, which makes some sense, white puts pressure to the central pawn, and now black is at the crossroad. Ideally speaking, he'd love to defend this pawn somehow, but it's not easy to do that. Putting the pawn to f5 is not really an option, as white's bizarre first move g4 would actually make some sense and white would be able to trade it off. Normally black would wish to bring the knight out and not only provide some protection to this pawn, but also to renew the threat to the pawn on g4. But I understand why black rejected this move. It looks like after g5 the knight will have to move away and then white would just take back his pawn on e4 with a good game. However, there was a little tactical trick that black missed here. Instead of moving the knight, he had a really strong counter-strike, bishop g4, while the knight is still there, guarding the bishop, and that counter-strike allows black to seize the initiative. While black missed this opportunity, he played the other move, which also seemed to make perfect sense. It's the move pawn h5, hitting this pawn and forcing white to make a decision, whether this pawn is going to be moved forward or traded off. Carlsen decided to take this pawn on h5, totally ruining his pawn structure on the king side. To this, black responded with pawn f5, really building this monumentum pawn center, which looks very strong. And yet this move f5 is a very nuanced mistake, because Carlsen is going to show that this strong center is not as strong as it looks at first. He goes d3, undermining the center, and he really needs to do something about it, as otherwise this bishop is totally dull, has no moves, but can't develop a knight, and this center indeed restricts everything. Black took here on d3, probably expecting Carlsen to recapture, but as we know, Carlsen has prepared a lot of surprises for his opponent. Instead of recapturing, he goes bishop g5. A nice move which seizes the initiative by hitting the queen, also develops a knight, and somehow justifies that awkward move pawn h4 that he played earlier. Now, black needs to somehow defend his queen, so he goes bishop e7, and finally Carlsen plays perhaps the first move in the game that his opponent expected. Just a normal chess move, recapturing this pawn on d3. Black took here on g5, and again, a lot of players, probably 99%, would just automatically recapture. And what Carlsen does instead? Well, you might have heard the rule that if you've got a fianchettoed bishop, you gotta keep it. Avoid trading it off, because it covers a lot of weaknesses around, and in general it's a strong piece putting pressure across this long diagonal. So Carlsen trades it off. But in this case, it's actually a great idea for white. We'll see why in a second. And it's pretty clear that it ruins black's pawn structure on the queen side, but also after this exchange on the king side, we see that the queen no longer hits this bishop which used to be there on g2, and this is what Carlsen foresaw while trading off the bishop. Therefore, he goes knight f3. Now he doesn't have to waste time guarding his bishop, therefore he can bring the knight into play, hitting the queen as well as this pawn in the center. Somehow, slowly but surely, Carlsen starts to take over. Black retreated back while maintaining this defense, and Carlsen goes queen a4, this time striking this pawn on c6. And even though Carlsen was the one playing these ridiculous moves and weakening his position basically all around, Now it looks like actually black's position is in shambles with so many weaknesses. Nevertheless, black goes bishop d7 to solidify the pawn, and Carlsen just castles queenside, totally fooling his opponent. Because somehow, despite white violated all the opening rules, now it looks like black did that. Because look at this position. White has completed his development, castled, and has a very nice position. While for black, it's rather the opposite. The king is centralized, and it's not easy to castle it, because in both ways, it's going to be extremely dangerous. Black is also mostly underdeveloped, and somehow Carlsen managed to get this winning advantage. Nevertheless, his opponent fights back. He goes c5, activating his bishop and hitting the white queen. So the queen goes here, and now black plays bishop c6, which is a mistake, but it is an understandable mistake. It hits the knight, it also pins it down to the rook, and black finally tries to create some counterplay, as otherwise white would just start attacking all these weaknesses. Alright, so what should white do here? Should white defend his knight or the rook on h1? Well, Carlsen gives up both of them. He plays knight takes c5, letting black choose which one he wants to capture, but both of the moves lose the game. It's actually not as simple as it looks at first. Now, queen takes e5 is pretty straightforward. Rook e1 wins the game, and that is clear. But the other variation which actually occurred in the game is a lot trickier. Bishop takes h1. Now, what do you do here as white? The automatic recapture would be a bad blunder, as after queen takes c5, white is lacking rooks, like quite a specific chess problem. Like you'd wish to move the rook to e1, but now you can't do that because there is no second rook, and black would just capture it, and that would win the game for black. In fact, right now, black is just up a rook with a winning position. White can't go there. So what can white do now? He's down a rook, this knight is hanging, but Carlsen plays knight g6. Another great move with the fork to black's heavy pieces, plus this bishop on h1 is also hanging. Still, black fights back with queen g5 check, winning a tempo, and now f4 also counter wins a tempo. So black still has no time to do something which he wishes to do, but he has to move the queen. Queen takes h5, normal, makes sense, attacks the knight, also guards this rook on h8. What do you do here? Even though Carlsen played a series of brilliant moves, it's still very easy to spoil it. For example, capturing the rook on h8 would be a bad mistake, because after queen takes, even though it looks like black's position is really bad, but somehow black is holding. Like, interestingly enough, this queen from the corner, from the ambush, still guards this bishop, so I can't take it. And by the way, this is the extra bishop that black has, therefore black is up a piece. White can't deliver this check, but black can cover, and he's still up a piece, and in fact, Stockfish claims that black is winning here, which is going to show that white should not be greedy here, and therefore Carlsen played queen e6 check. White wishes to maintain his active knight, and he doesn't need this passive rook in the corner, which does nothing anyway. For example, right now you can see that this knight is doing a good job controlling the e7 square. Now black can't cover, as in the previous variation, as that would lead to a simple checkmate, because of this knight, which is still alive. It means that black cannot do that, and he needs to move the king away. Plus our knight takes away this square, so he goes king to d8. Alright, what would you do here? Well, a lot of players love playing d4 on the first move, and Carlsen says, I prefer when it's the last move, and goes d4 in this position. The idea is, if the d-file is opened, for example after the trade, that would be an instant checkmate. Therefore black can't afford that. He's trying to keep the d-file closed for the rook, but now Carlsen goes knight e5. It's not just a centralization of the knight, he prepares knight to f7, checking the king, which is quite a deadly threat. That would force black to give up the queen, but there is not much black can do here because also white's got this queen to d7 checkmate threat, which is even more straightforward. Therefore black played knight f6, covering this square so that queen d7 is not an option anymore. And now Carlsen could play knight f7, forcing black to give up the queen, like this, and that would win the game. But he found an even stronger move. Well, he achieves this perfect centralization with the move pawn d5, and this subtle pawn move forced black to resign, or rather to run out of time, but black has no defense. This d5 move cuts up the bishop, and therefore on the next move, after whatever that black does, let's say he sacks the bishop right here, there is knight to c6, and that is what Carlsen prepared, and black is defenseless. As you can see, pawn weaknesses and pawn structure can really make or break your chess. And if you wish to know the 5 most common chess pawn structure mistakes, check out this video.